Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I am pleased to have Bob Gardner with us. Bob is the founder of the Freedom Specialist, a body-based approach to happiness, health, and well-being. Bob is also the author of the book Built for Freedom and host of the podcast Alive and Free. As a transformational specialist, Bob's aim is to share his unique tools with the world to empower everyone to find happiness, health, and well-being on autopilot. For the past 15 years, Bob has been incorporating multiple tools and knowledge gained from his years of experience in martial arts, breathwork, functional psychology, deep tissue release, and numerous other healing modalities to help thousands of people permanently put an end to their depression, anxiety, and addiction by identifying and healing what's at the core of these issues. Welcome, Bob. Thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure, Lauren. This sounds exciting. Should be fun.
Yeah, I am excited for sure. So tell us your backstory. What got you into this?
I messed everything up and had to dig my way out of the hole.
Okay.
I had been since I was like any kid, you grow up socially awkward, whatever. My dad was a fighter pilot, so we moved around a lot, and I just frequently felt like didn't belong. I was the outsider.
Right.
Anything that any normal kid would have. I didn't have a traumatic childhood or anything, but somewhere
Right.
along the way, I went through puberty and I had questions about sexuality. And
Yeah.
my dad was really awkward with those questions. He told me that a condom was an emergency water bag, which when I found out the real answer, I also found out I couldn't actually ask him those questions. And so I found the answers on my own.
Right.
This was pre-internet, so we're talking art books
Mm-hmm.
and things of that nature. And then the internet hit, and pretty soon I discovered that, what I was figuring out how to socially interact with the women. And then after a while, that became the sort of go-to escape. 18 years go by, and that had been my escape. It was early on in that process that I figured out that that was what all the people in church were preaching about when they said that that was like a sin, that that was bad.
Right.
So early on, I developed this sense that I was going to hell, that I was not going to heaven at all, that I had already messed everything up, and that there was really no way to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And not that that's what they meant by that, but that's how I took it as a
Sure.
kid. And so this buildup of shame and guilt, and
Right.
then I find out, oh, there's a bunch of people that have this. It's called an addiction. And so I go to these 12-step meetings and I do all the other stuff. And I learned some stuff. I was comforted. I found some, friendships here and there, but nothing was changing. Nobody in the room was really getting over it.
Mm-hmm.
And it became this disease that I was going to be with for life. And then one day, my wife confronts me about she was aware, but at this point she wanted to know like how far has this gone? So I
Right.
start to reveal to her like, yeah, I went to chat rooms. I didn't
Sure.
pay. I tell her I didn't pay. I promise, because I didn't want. She's like, why didn't you pay? I'm like, well, I didn't want the money to be traced back to me, like, which was honest. I didn't want to
Yeah.
be caught in it, but
Right.
it wasn't like I didn't pay because I wanted to be faithful. It was I
Sure.
didn't pay because I didn't want to be caught. And so she was like, I think I'm gonna leave. Like, I don't think I'm in for this anymore. She'd already been planning, and it's like, do we leave in the middle of the night? Do we leave when he's at work? And
Mm-hmm.
so then I was confronted with, here I am struggling, I desperately wanting to not be controlled by this,
Mm-hmm.
but not knowing a way out, already going through all these bipolar mood swings and these depressive cycles, suicidal at times, like walking the streets at night, hoping to be hit by a bus, just
Right.
wishing for, because I didn't want to kill myself and leave my family with that. And so I stuck around because I didn't want to cause them pain. But in the middle of that, that meant I was causing them more pain and myself more pain. And so she just said, I'm going to leave. And that night I was like, I have to fix something. So I just started doing what most people do, just control it, hang in there. And that worked for a couple months. And then things started getting, stressed out. And I was, I can't do this anymore. She left for school one day to pick up the kids. I was running a martial arts school.
Mm-hmm.
And so that she leaves, I see her out the window, and my whole system does what every person who's struggling with an addiction does. Like, oh, now's your chance, the used cars salesman in the head is like, now's your chance, man. Act now while no one's watching.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
My hands are shaking, my heartbeat is going wild. I got this cold chemical flush through my system. I'm rooted to the spot. And then I have this weird out of body experience
Mm-hmm.
that is a vision of myself as a 90-year-old still stuck in that spot, still having to fight.
Oh
And I
my.
was like, oh, I can't do this anymore. Like, I don't want to die at this moment, but I don't want to live that life. And so I had to figure
Sure.
figure this out. So I threw out everything that I had learned that wasn't working.
Yeah.
And I just became the guinea pig for my own life. I was like, let me go back to my roots. Let me start questioning, what do I mean when I say I'm depressed? What do I mean when I say I'm anxious? What do I mean when I say I have an addiction? How do I know that?
Right.
And I started looking at these physiological components of it, and I started tweaking those and working with those. And then in very short order, I started seeing the urges going away, the behavior. I didn't need as many coping behaviors. My mind was freed from this stuff. I learned how to delete that stuff from my mind. And so
Hmm.
that even the drugs that I got into, like, that became less of an urge
Hmm. Hmm.
because there wasn't anything to cope with anymore.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. So you said that your background, or at the time you were working in martial arts, so you had some of that background.
Yeah.
What exactly were you drawing on? What did you do in order to help to get yourself to this place of freedom?
Yeah, so I had already in that period of time been, I think like most people who are in there, I've been chasing every savior on the planet. So every ad that I saw of somebody who had an answer.
Yeah, of
And
course.
and there were things that felt interesting to me and things that I could sort of hide behind so that it wasn't me coming out to everyone as the pervert next door, you know? And so
Hmm.
it was like I chased like Wim Hof's breath work for a bit, and
Sure.
I trained with him and his stuff, and I had been training already in like this years, like decades in all for various different types of meditation and kung fu and tai chi, and like so
Mhm.
physical work was not an issue.
Right.
And so it was like I trained for 4 years in Zen mindfulness and with a teacher there, and I learned various forms of body work like biodynamic craniosacral therapy. I trained for 4 years in that, wrote a book on that that became like a textbook for some of the people, and ended up using that to a certain extent. So I was developing my ability to feel inside of my body the whole
Right.
time.
Yeah.
And that was where I started.
Hmm.
I was, because I couldn't, the idea of a disease, like I have no recourse.
Hmm.
And so I was like, what is an average bloke who went through bankruptcy and has no money in his bank account and doesn't have access to research funds and grants and millions of dollars to just
Right.
test all this stuff in a
Whatever.
lab? What does that average bloke have that can help him walk away from this? And the courage that I took was the Jesus. Like I was sitting in the 12-step program, and I know that maybe some people aren't Christians or whatnot, but I was sitting in these 12-step programs, and they were talking about how we were going to be this way for life and how higher
Mhm.
power, this, that, and the other. And I was like, when I read this story about Jesus catching the woman in adultery, he
Mhm.
didn't say, I want you back here for a meeting every week.
Right.
And
Yep.
he did, it wasn't like, well, you're going to be struggling with this forever. It was like, you're good. Go
Right.
and sin no more.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
everybody who is preaching the sort of healing, I was like, what kind
Sure.
of beta version of Jesus are we running? Like, I want the full
Amen.
version, not
Amen.
the trial version, you know?
Right.
So,
Yes, exactly.
so I was like, well, if it can happen that fast,
Hmm.
what has to happen?
Yep.
And so I was paying attention and challenging the questions.
Hmm.
Like, what is addiction? Is it actually a disease other than saying dis-ease? But I was like, well, if it's dis-ease, yeah, where am I at ill at ease?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I started noticing tension patterns build up. I started noticing like, well, if my breathing's different, that's why I went to the Wim Hof stuff.
Right.
And I
Sure.
started tweaking these physical things that I could do: breathing, movement, relaxation, posture, all that stuff. And then
Hmm.
I also had the thought in my head that's like, well, what went in has to come out, kind of like throwing up.
Sure.
And so I started just writing.
Yeah.
Well, I was an artist actually. So,
Okay.
um, and like, spent a lot of training in the fine arts. I got a master's degree in fine arts, and I was like, okay, well, I have all this porn inside. I better get it out. That was a horrible idea. I was making really good pornography.
Oh,
It
yeah.
lasted for like 30, 40 minutes, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I went in the backyard and burned it all. My wife wisely was like, that's not a good idea. I was like, I know, but I got to go on something, you know?
Right. You just had to try it.
And so, so then I went in. I was like, "What is it?" And it's the idea that came was like make a list.
Hmm.
So I was like, "Of what?" No answer. Okay, cool. I'll just make a list. And I just made a list. It ended up being people, groups of people, a whole like it was like 92 different names of people, groups of people, people who I didn't remember, like that kid from elementary school that I pushed down, whose name I don't know. You
Yeah.
know, the IRS made the list. The, you know, and my grandpa who had died and I hadn't been able to say goodbye. It was like a whole bunch of people that it didn't make sense to me. But I
Uh-huh.
was like, okay, cool. Well, I'll just write them all. And I started getting rid of all of these emotional things. Some of
Uh,
them were
baggage.
positive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
Some of them were positive.
Uh-huh.
Some of them were like my grandpa was, I didn't hate him. I just hadn't gotten to say goodbye before he died.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Some of them were porn related, like porn stars or the makers of YouTube. How dare you create a platform that allows this to happen?
Sure. Yeah.
And so all of this frustration, and in the middle of writing that, I had like all the emotions were coming up.
Mm,
Then the next thought was, well, because I was making it something physical that I could work with, right? I was taking this, I'm stuck into, well, this is the thing I'm stuck with on paper,
channel.
and
Right.
making it physical. It was
Mm-hmm.
only years later that I came to learn that physical feedback is the key.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that talking through things is not useful unless you've anchored it in some sort of physical experience.
Yeah.
So after that, I was like, I have to read. By the way, in order to write this, I was terrified. So I turned on like really nice music that would keep me going out, like in case I started to go down a hole, like I could just listen to the music it would bring me out. I
Right.
think I prayed for every guardian angel on the planet to be present
Yeah.
while I was there. And then I read it out loud. And
Uh-huh.
as I was reading it out loud, it was the first time in my life that a level of compassion for myself showed up, because now I was like third person. I was reading somebody else's words
Yep.
almost.
Yep.
And I started to see these trends of
Mm-hmm.
thought processes that were running in my mind, beliefs about myself that I didn't realize I carried.
Mm-hmm.
And it was underneath all the blame. It was underneath all the sadness and the reaction.
Yes.
And I was like, wow, I felt bad for that guy. Like he's
Yeah.
been carrying that his whole life.
Right. Yeah.
And so then I burned those. And
Mhm.
then I was like, but that's, just write a letter to myself about that. And then so I wrote out all that stuff. And
Mhm.
I spent 2.5 hours in a park, just everything I could think of that I had against myself. And I wrote it all out. And then I did the same thing. I read it and I burned it. And then
Mhm.
I was like, well, but that's not the whole truth, is it? So
Mhm.
then I wrote everything that I missed.
Mhm.
All of the awards I'd earned, all the skills I'd learned, all the desires in my heart to be amazing.
Yeah.
And I held that up in the mirror and I looked at myself in the mirror. I was like, look, this is also true about me.
Yes. Absolutely.
I can't it's a lie for me to say because I did this thing, that's who I am,
Sure. Yes.
when I've done all these other things.
Right.
So that was the beginning of me trying to find a way to get down to the root of the problem.
Mhm.
And it was like that was amazing. I spent a couple weeks just on cloud nine, like no problems at all.
Mhm.
And months likely. I didn't know what to say at the 12-step meetings. I was like, hi, my name's Bob. I'm not an addict anymore. Sorry.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
they didn't appreciate that because you're
Yeah.
supposed to be an addict for life.
Yeah.
But and like I did a couple of other things here and there, and I started working deeply with the body and my senses, like from that point on. So I cleared out all this gunk, but I realized I needed to retrain my body itself,
Mhm. Mhm.
to get the memo down into the flesh and not just
Yeah.
in the head.
Mhm.
And so most of what I worked with was like movement and breathing, just all this martial arts stuff. I was like, I got to live a good life.
Yeah.
And like, if I'm happy, I'm happy. And then I'm not going to these things.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
how can I live happier? And how can I train my body to be happy on autopilot
Yeah.
instead of like, no, I have to do all this hard work. And so I let it slip for like 4 years. I didn't do anything. I just kept training that. And then somebody else needed some help. And I had a business coach like, dude, stop teaching Kung Fu. There's a dime a dozen of those. Like there's a
Right.
lot of people struggling with porn addiction, with sex addiction, with depression, with anxiety. And like
Mhm.
nobody really has an answer. Even
Sure.
the psychology industry has indicated like this is going to be here for life.
Yeah. Right.
And so I started helping people with porn and sex addiction at first, and then that snowballed, and we had women with like rape victims and a lot of sexual abuse and body image issues, and guys who are struggling with various different types of addictions and
Mhm.
anger issues. I just got a note from a guy. We had a retreat last week, and he's like, "Hey, I don't have anxiety anymore, and now I'm actually attracted to my wife for the first time in a long time."
Oh.
And we had just breathed and moved and worked with his body and helped open up his tissues and really challenged. Like it wasn't rocket science.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
And so I told him, yeah, well, just keep helping your body feel better. You'll watch that grow really well. So it was
right.
amazing.
Yeah, I love this. So it's so interesting to me how the Holy Spirit will take each individual person through their own path that ultimately is similar. Like there's similarities for absolutely
Yep.
everybody, but he's taking what you already knew and
Mhm.
helping you to apply that so that you could obtain freedom. But you had to first get rid of all the junk. Like in naturopathic medicine, our main like the
Right.
philosophy is you identify and you remove the obstacles to cure. You give the
Mhm.
body the building blocks it needs to heal itself, and then you stimulate your vitality so that your body can do what it needs to do. If it's been
Yeah.
suppressed for a long time, it's not going to be able to. That's exactly
Mhm.
what you did on a
Right.
psychological level. That's fabulous.
Yeah.
So, how do you tweak the breath work and the movement for somebody who has trauma or somebody who has addiction or somebody who has anxiety? Is there like no formula and it depends on the person, or is there a pattern that's specific to each issue or what?
Hang on just a sec.
Sure.
There is there are general patterns.
Okay.
Um, in the beginning, I tried to map this out on the body. Remember, like I spent years as a registered craniosacral therapist,
Yeah.
working in very much the way you described, and I tried to map it because people had told me, oh yeah, anger resides here. You look at the Ayurvedic medicine or you look at the
Sure.
Chinese medicine, and you're like, okay, cool, good. These are where these emotions are housed.
Right.
But as I challenged those in people in the
Yeah.
beginning, like I would put pressure on people in those areas, or we would do some sort of percussion on it to see what came up.
Right.
And everybody was a little bit different. And
Okay.
so these maps became not useful most of the time, other than like, well, I have this info in case it's useful sometime.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
So what I boiled it down to was the thing that is easy enough to recognize is that tension in the body creates some sort of problem in circulation, in lymphatic flow, and it also tends to grab whatever chemistry is in there and hold it.
Yep. Yep. Hmm.
So in a traumatic experience,
Hmm.
you have all of this emotion and all of this chemistry flowing, and you're tense
Hmm.
because you are not sitting there like a rag doll,
Hmm.
unless you've disassociated, like in a rape or something like that, right? And so that tension holds and like squeezes that chemistry into the muscle.
Hmm.
And then, because there's not really any evidence that that might not happen again, that muscle doesn't really unload itself.
Sure. Yeah.
When it does, every little bit that it relaxes, a
Hmm.
little bit of that chemistry floods the bloodstream, and the person feels like it's happening all over again. They get quote unquote triggered.
Yeah.
And so they tense again because they don't want that to happen.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so when it comes to the deep tissue work, it is a matter of helping unload that whole thing while understanding that all those emotions will come to the surface, but they're only coming to the surface to get out.
Get out.
They're
Right.
not coming to the surface because you're being re-traumatized,
Right. Right. Right.
which you would know
Reframing
well.
the experience.
Yeah,
Right. Okay.
right. And so that was the easiest thing to recognize, to develop the ability to notice at more precise levels where is tension being held in the body. And as we release that tension,
Mm-hmm.
it starts to open up, and then they have these emotions or these thoughts or memories will come up, and then they'll leave.
Right.
And they don't mean anything. That's the
Mhm.
next problem that people have. They're, oh, what does it mean if I had this? It doesn't mean anything other than you had that experience.
Just purging it. Yeah.
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 And if we grab onto it, then what we've created is more tension around having that kind of experience. And that's what
Right.
we're after.
Yes. Interesting.
And so I tell them meaning is a mean thing to do.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so the tension piece is one of just where are you holding tension? And
Right.
that could be you had an injury in some place. And
Hmm.
so when you had this traumatic experience, the injury got more tense. And so that might be where it's stored. And that might be in your knee and not in your liver, even though liver is associated with anger in a lot of times.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Makes
Um,
sense.
I had a guy, for instance, I was just trying to explain this, and I grabbed his bicep with my
Mhm.
thumb,
Yeah.
and I could see his face like the expression on his face could sort of like wiggle, like a little
Sure.
concerned. And I was like, oh, I guess we're going to stay here for a bit. And so
Yeah.
I'm describing what's going on. And he's sitting there and kind of giving himself the internal pep talk for a second, like, oh, okay. Yeah, I got this.
Yeah.
And I was like narrating this. Oh, he's giving himself a pep talk. He's like, no, no, I got it. And then he stopped, and then he just started bawling for like 5 minutes. And
Right.
I'm just holding his bicep, like not lightly. I'm putting
Yeah. Yeah.
pressure on the
Sure.
nut on the bicep.
Yeah.
And then as he's sitting there, like all this emotion comes. I didn't ask him anything about it. You don't have to talk about it.
Yes.
That is the beautiful thing. Like talking about it is sometimes useful,
Right.
Most of the stuff we struggle with is nonverbal. It
Hmm.
like was an emotion or a feeling or a sensation or something. And to have to stop and put a word to it for it to go by is
Hmm.
like having traffic cones on the freeway. Like, oh, now
Yeah.
we got everybody slow by and one by one go through the checkpoint instead of
Yeah.
just let the traffic flow.
Let it
And
out.
so I
Yeah.
didn't ask him about it.
Yeah.
He just lets it out and then he kind of comes back up. I hit it a couple times to work things through, wiggled it a little bit, and then helped him relax his arm.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, I was like, hey, anything come up? Like anything you want to share?
Hmm.
And he's like, no, I had this girlfriend when I was 15
Hmm.
and she was really manipulative, 15 or 16, when she was really manipulative.
Yeah.
And like it was a really rough relationship. And I haven't thought about her in years. And I don't know where that came from, but it was a really rough time in my life. And I said, well, what does that have to do with your bicep?
Yeah.
He goes, I have no idea. I mean, I guess I started lifting weights a lot at that point in time.
Ah, interesting.
So it's like
Yeah.
normal exercise, normal tension can be the place where
Right.
it's not like girlfriends are stored in your bicep, guys. It's
Right. Uh,
it's just like that's what the brain, what is not in touch with the outside world, associates with everything coming through that experience, right? So
mhm.
your brain's just guessing, and it's like, well, that tension there, oh, I remember when that happened before. It's
Right.
the girlfriend thing,
Yeah.
and
And it makes all
you
the
know,
connections. Yeah.
yeah.
Is it true, would you say, like I hear what you're saying as far as like don't stop and stop the traffic, let it get out. And
Mhm.
I think in many cases that's where my personal opinion that talk therapy kind of goes sideways because it's almost like re-traumatizing people because you're gonna,
Yep.
go over and over and over things. At the same time, occasionally you said that sometimes it is useful, and I'm
Yep.
assuming part of the reason why it's useful in the circumstances when it is if the emotion that is getting released has to do with the worldview that needs to be reprogrammed. Like if you're
Yep.
believing a lie, that has to get recognized and turned around so that you don't end up in the same place again. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah, from my experience, it's the talking about it helps them get down to that belief
Yes,
that
yes,
they
yes,
have
yes.
or the worldview that they have, and that
Right,
one spans across a lot of
right.
events and not just the one.
Not just the one. Right,
So if someone's having an experience with that,
right.
um, and they're bringing up like he didn't really need to say anything like that was the case, except that he was there on a longer retreat, and so we were able to talk about some other stuff that was going on
Yeah,
with him.
right.
But often a lot of the common lies that people believe are they're worthless, they're unlovable, they're not good enough, they'll never be good enough, they're a disappointment, they're broken,
Yeah.
nobody likes them, whatever version of that is.
Mhm.
And the event seems to be the evidence for it.
Connect. Yes,
And
yes.
so it's not yeah, so it's not the event itself
It's what it,
necessarily, but
yeah,
it's what it means. And then talking about it helps me break down the event
and
in such a
recognize.
way that they look at the event and they realize that's not actually evidence of that at all.
Exactly. Yes, that makes
Oh,
perfect sense.
so like I had a guy whose mom, Lee, his mom had abused him from the time he was like 2, 3 years old until she kicked him out of the house at 16.
Mhm.
She abused him physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, you name it. Like she had multiple guys in the house all the time. He didn't know his father. She used to quote scripture at him while abusing him
Oh
as
my
a way of getting him
gosh.
like honor your mother. Like really twisted, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
so so at one point in time, she used to always tell him like that he was a horrible person or whatnot to try and manipulate him into doing certain things.
Yeah.
And at one point in time, we were talking about one of these instances, and so I got the details of it, and then I just asked him the question like, what evidence do you have that your mom was a great judge of character?
Mm-hmm.
And like that broke something in him because he
Right.
was these events were evidence that he's a horrible person
Uh-huh.
because of the authority figure in those events said so.
Yes.
And
Right.
so then we look at all the people that she had in her life and all the things
Yeah.
that got messed up around it and all the things that she did. And he was like, oh,
Right. That's like the kingpin or that
yeah,
cornerstone piece of belief that actually holds everything else up.
yeah.
Interesting.
So those are the instances where the story is useful. But I'll be honest, like in the beginning, I was
Mm.
listening to everybody's story
Right.
because I thought that's how you needed to get through it. And then I taught them how to get down to these core beliefs,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I was then having to process their story. I
Yeah.
was then like, I got to get off the phone. I didn't know that was possible. I got to go on a long walk, honey. And then I just walk the neighborhoods and try and like get that stuff out of my head. And I
Right.
was like, there has to be a faster way and a
Hmm.
more efficient way than having people tell their stories,
Yeah.
because I know I have to deal with it. They don't actually want to tell it again.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
what is that?
Right. Right.
What I realized as I kept going down the rabbit hole is that the story lives, let's say here, like right in the middle, right? If we're
Hmm.
talking about up on the top is the symptoms,
Hmm.
the behaviors, the emotions, whatever else it is,
Yeah.
and the events that the memories are below that, and then the big belief, the worldview is
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
Before that worldview came a whole lot of different cascade change of tensions and emotions and nerve firings and all that other stuff further down.
Mhm.
That was the body's initial reaction to its environment.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
if I could retrain that, and I mean, I was training with spies, like we're, we're there, we had Vladimir one time was just like, okay, um, I got this, there was this time that I was fighting with this Russian German, I mean, this German spy,
Yeah.
he's
Right.
Russian,
Sure.
and he's like, he got behind me with a rope and he choked me out. Everybody in the room's like, what? Oh, okay. Like, that's the point of the story. He's like, no, you don't understand. While I was unconscious, I broke his arm and I escaped. And we're like, wait, what? While you're unconscious? Because it's not unconscious, it's other conscious. And if you
Uh-huh.
can train that other conscious
Uh-huh.
to respond to the world without trauma, without pain, without anxiety, without frustration, then your body never has the signal anymore for your brain to bring up all the trauma. You just don't have to deal with it.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I started heading, was like, let's just train the body's natural response to its environment
Uh-huh.
to be a response that feels wonderful, that
Uh-huh.
feels functional, that feels amazing. And then all those memories don't even have to be looked at.
So what you mean is that, so going back to what you said about autopilot, the idea
Yeah.
of that's what when he was unconscious, obviously that's impossible, but it was subconscious, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
And that's where his training just kicked in and he was able to do what he needed to do. Okay, so that was one of the things that really intrigued me about your bio is you said that you learned some of your techniques from Russian spies. Is that what you
Yeah.
meant?
Yeah. 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 Many, many, many things from these, I still train with them. They still keep blowing my mind, but yeah.
Okay, so let's pause for a second and go there. Tell me more about this experience working with spies and what else you've learned from them.
So the Russian system of, I mean, you got to think about this. Like if you're in Siberia, say 500 years ago,
Yeah,
there's not millions of people. So every person in the tribe or the group is essential, right?
yeah,
And they have to deal with hunting for food and making weaponry and taking care of the horses and fishing and injuries. And so every person is sort of essential. And in the middle of that, they're like the Mongolians are running the show and they're sweeping through camp in massive hordes of horses and stealing people and telling and selling them at the Persian markets. And the
right.
Russian tribes up north are running through camp and trying to like conquer the area for a greater unified nation. And you
Yeah.
have the Persians down south that are invading for trade and whatnot. And so you're constantly having to deal with the weather and the environment, like the winter snows and everything, and like starvation or lack of food and injury and whatnot. And
Uh-huh.
what they developed was not everywhere, right? There were still obviously people that would go on raiding parties and rape and pillage and all that other stuff. But in certain little pockets, this way of training that uh, Cossack, the word Cossack comes from Kazakh, right? And that means like a masterless person, or a masterless horseman originally, but like one who isn't mastered by anything, not
Okay.
by wind and rain and snow and injury and pain and even death. Like they're
Right.
not mastered by it. They're like in charge of their person. So their way of training was a way of helping a person have such a strong psyche or such a strong spirit that it didn't matter what was happening on the outside. They
Oh,
were like, stable, you
right.
know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and some of them took it to such a spiritual level. I mean, it got sort of absorbed into the Orthodox tradition
Build your
of
house upon a rock,
Christianity.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so that all of the training, there's no forms, there's not anything that you would see in normal martial arts. I mean, we're swinging chains at each other or fighting in the water or like
Yeah,
pulling
yeah.
knives and like running through the woods and using sticks and improvised weaponry and blindfolded, just all kinds of stuff. And I had done a number of those things in kung fu circles, but those were all like for show. So I could already move in some of these ways,
Mhm.
but the Russian form of training for me was like, oh, you're afraid? Let's confront that.
Uh-huh.
And you're going to stand there and I'm going to hit you and you're not going to block and you're not going to, and you're going to look at how how fear manifests in your body
Right.
and you're going to get rid of it. And so it
Wow.
was like, I'm going to take you through pain
Uh-huh.
and you're going to take me through pain
Yeah.
because we're the only people who can prepare each other for a world that might be worse. And if
Sure.
I take you
Yeah.
through something that's worse than anything you'll feel out there,
Mm-hmm.
then I have prepared you for life. It's like this sort of brotherhood,
Yeah.
uh, this camaraderie that's built with like it's time to stop coddling each other
Right.
and actually
Yeah.
prepare each other for life. So a lot of this was like learning how to get hit and take a hit and deep tissue work, using sticks and whips and chains and stuff to where you're learning to breathe and move and relax in a way that if something does happen, it starts to go away. And then somewhere in there, I started to see that pain is produced in the mind. Now, all the research indicates this.
Yep.
That's why you can like blunt a nerve and the body doesn't feel pain. It's because pain is a production of the mind.
Sure. Right.
It's not in the tissue.
Uh-huh.
And I started to realize that I didn't have to experience these things as pain. I could experience them first neutral, and then
Right.
sometimes even with pleasantness. Like it felt wonderful to be. It doesn't feel like a tickle or anything.
Did they really?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
it's like imagine being a drum and just having this thing go boom, like this life just run through your system all at once.
Right.
And like that's kind of how it felt like. And on top of all of the subtle meditative movement stuff that I'd learned from my years in Kung Fu, where I was building these waves of pleasantness through my body anyway,
Mm-hmm.
like now I could do this with a walk when I'm walking, when I'm stepping and stuff. And so part of the training that I developed, because they don't really, that training doesn't really confront the stuff that I was working with. It wasn't
Right.
like we understand that emotions are there, but just keep training this way and they'll go away, which is true.
Yeah, sure.
But it's very combatively oriented,
Of course. Yeah.
and the emotional and mental well-being is sort of like a byproduct. And I was like, no, these people have problems. We need to focus the training on what it is they're doing.
Sure.
So I started pulling in from yoga and from kung fu and all these different things and stripping out the cultural stuff and going like physiologically,
What's
what are
happening?
we doing?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how do we stimulate the body to produce its own painkillers? How do we stimulate the body to produce its own BDNF, for instance, and so that you can start to change neural pathways much more quickly? How do we
Right.
stimulate the body to let go of tensions? And
Yeah.
all of that became stuff I grabbed from them and these other traditions to do what it is that I do now.
To put it all together. Interesting. So as far as like, so the body work and the breath work and all of that, back to the idea of how you apply this in the given individual in front of you, where do you
Mhm.
start in order to figure out where to zoom in?
So the first thing, there's really only basically two, but kind of three variables that you're working with, right?
Okay.
The two main variable, the third one is like a byproduct of the other one. So,
Okay.
so ease in the body and clarity of mind. Those are
Okay.
the two things that we work with, right?
Okay.
The more at ease the body is, it doesn't even matter how you get there.
Hmm.
This is the beautiful part. This is what anybody at home can like start to understand.
Hmm.
The more at ease your body is, the
Hmm.
less triggerable you become,
Of course. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay.
right? So the happier your body feels,
Right.
you just don't have to deal with triggers. There's no coping behaviors necessary,
Right.
right? And then clarity of mind has to do with being able to discern the difference between your five senses and
Uh-huh.
what you've made of those five senses, all the belief and the
Uh-huh.
meaning and everything else.
Yeah.
When they're present, just there, looking at what's in front of them,
Hmm.
all the other stuff starts to go away and their brain rewires itself pretty quickly. So
Okay.
it's like, let me, like, if you've ever lost your keys and they're like in your purse or something and you've
Yeah.
looked through it a bunch of different times
And you
and
don't
you
see
can't find them,
it.
you don't see them, so you're walking around the house, your breathing changes, you're
Yeah.
starting to stomp around, you're
Yeah.
feeling everything that people label as frustration. It's not
Right.
frustration, it is breathing changes and tension and movement, jerky movement and stuff. Then you
Sure.
start to talk to people like, I know you guys had it last. And you start accusing everybody, and then you reach through and you realize that it slid underneath the little pouch or something, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
find them. Immediately, in that moment of clarity,
You
all
relate.
the frustration goes away.
Yes.
The
Okay.
tension goes away, the breathing changes, everything changes because you saw
Yeah.
the truth set you free,
Yep.
and you instead of the lie that you had told.
Interesting. Okay. So, it sounds almost like if you are able to separate those things. Like you don't even necessarily have to put words to it, or do you?
No.
If you're okay, so if this is kind of just the idea behind all meditation, where you become fully present in the moment and
Yep.
you recognize that your mind can be a manager observing what's going on as opposed to in the moment and intertwined with it. Is it essentially that concept?
Yeah, yeah. And so let me finish answering your other question. How do I start with people? I
Yes.
start with giving them, like the first program I have them work with is Choose Your Own Emotion. That's the name of the program.
Awesome. Yeah.
And the first week is, this is a basic routine to do when you wake up in the morning. Here's an audio, use it as your alarm.
Yeah.
This is a basic routine to do at night. So the aim is wake up without in such a way that you put your body into a state that is not just, oh, I'm awake, I'm ready, but
Mhm.
is calm, energized, feels
Mhm.
alive, so
Yeah.
that you primed your system to not be triggerable for the next little while.
Yeah.
And then at night, let's get you going into sleep better. So, because if you sleep better, you're going to wake up better, and then you're going to do
Sure.
that routine.
The whole
So
thing.
that's the first thing I do.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
it's pretty much the same for everyone as a starting point. And then depending on what seems to work best, we start to adjust from there.
Okay. Okay.
Then I teach them, all right, now let's identify what's happening in the moment. If
Mhm.
you're triggered or you're emotional or you're whatever, what's actually happening? I teach them emotional ninjutsu.
Mhm.
What's happening and where in your body do you feel it?
Right.
I'll
Uh,
everybody listening,
yep.
guaranteed your fingernails are not emotional.
Uh-huh. Right.
Guaranteed. So the reason that it's so dumb, but like your knee pits, your butt cheeks, these are things that like when you check, I had a lady in the middle of a panic attack and I was like, okay, where are you feeling it? Are your butt cheeks panicked? And she just burst out laughing. She's like, no, but the panic disappeared because
Yeah.
she got clear on the thing
Right.
I'm feeling isn't everywhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that is powerful. So where is it? Then, now that you know where it is, breathe, loosen, escape. Breathe different. It doesn't matter if it's faster or slower or louder or anything. Breathe
Mhm.
different, loosen the area, relax it, and escape. Get into a posture that doesn't allow that thing to land on you anymore.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
teach them that. And then
Mhm.
the third thing I do is, okay, now let's go through the things that you're afraid of that aren't actually happening. When a thought comes, here is a
Right.
simple, and I teach them a basic visualization for how to start to like get rid of the emotional reaction to those thoughts.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
that's 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And not everybody's great at visualizing, so there's a bunch of different ways to do it,
Yeah.
Um, but like that's where I start with people.
Yeah.
And then because then once they have a baseline of like what is and isn't working, then we can adjust from there. But if they never start, if they're like, well, no, I have to find the right one for me before I start, it doesn't
Right.
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because how are we going to know what the right one is? You
Yeah.
you need the physical experience in order to know.
In
Yeah.
order to figure that out. So you said that there's three components. One is a byproduct of the other two. What's the byproduct?
Is the amount of time you're spent. I put this out as an algorithm to determine a person's happiness quotient.
Oh, okay.
Instead of your IQ, your EQ, this is your HQ,
Okay.
and it's a function of the amount of clarity of mind you have times the amount of physical ease you had divided by the amount of time you're spent in limiting beliefs and reactions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, that way in a given day, if you ask yourself, okay, well, what percent of my body feels pleasant?
Mm-hmm.
What percent feels a little unpleasant or uncomfortable?
Right.
Cool. Now we have a sense of what that component is.
Right.
And, how aware am I of my environment right now versus fixated on some thought processes? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a percentage. And
Sure.
then like, cool, what percent of my experience
Right.
is being grabbed by reactions to things
Sure. Uh-huh.
or these ruminating thoughts? And
Right.
if it's like, yeah, it's 90%. Most people, it's really up there. All day
Yeah.
long, you're thinking about things. If you've ever driven home and forgot and not realized, like gotten there and been like, did I
How
run
did I
into
get
red light?
here? Right. Yeah. Sure.
Well, then you've spent time in that space.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so that's the divider. And
Mm-hmm.
with those, then you have a sense of, okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know what to work on. Do I need to attach, like grab and go challenge some limiting beliefs? Do I need to just focus on this moment and working on my presence and my clarity? Or is my body uncomfortable and I need to go do some physical exercise?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a simple way of
Okay.
pinpointing what is the issue rather than just being like, well, I'm unhappy.
Right. And now
You
what?
know,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Interesting. So for most people, is the
yeah.
amount of time it takes to get from maximum tension for them to maximum clarity and relaxation kind of similar to how long it takes to create a habit, like 21 to 90 days, or how, like what's the typical amount of time it takes for somebody to learn how to achieve this and maintain it on a regular basis?
Yeah, so we run, that's a great question. We run these retreats 5 days long. They're 5 days, and in those 5 days, I have them morning to night.
Yeah,
We're using, like, we're controlling their nutrition, we're control, their sleep times, and
sure.
and we're running them through in the morning, like really simple things, showing them how to use their voice and posture and whatnot to produce these incredible waves of well-being. We're training movement, we're doing breath work, we're doing deep tissue work, we're
Mhm,
challenging thought processes. We're doing all this and in the end, like, Lee came,
mhm,
everything he had against his mom, all
mhm,
that years of trauma that he'd spent 30 plus years talking to therapists around, gone,
mhm. Wow,
gone.
that's
So
amazing.
yeah, the people leave those and they just have this like honeymoon period, so to speak,
Mhm.
because they're coasting. We've done so much to put their body into a new state.
Right,
And then to maintain that,
right.
that's where the thing is. And what my hunch is, I don't have any like hard data on it, but my hunch is that it operates anywhere from 21 to 48 days, where
Right.
you run into this, like, how long does it take for my system to learn this thing?
Yeah.
For me, it's a constant exploration.
Mhm.
Like, I never measured it, because in my mind I was like, wow, I feel better now. Ooh, what else do I need to work on? Like, it was like I never
Right.
stopped to be like, oh, I made
Yeah, nobody
it.
arrives this side of heaven in
Yeah.
that way. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, well, no, in my mind, I'm like, no, I feel heavenly, right? The highest heaven I know, that's my measurement for the day. And
Yeah,
like,
right.
am I
Sure.
there? Well, if not, what do I need to adjust? And then one day something falls away and I discover, wow, there's a whole nother layer of this heavenly experience. Cool. And that
Mhm,
becomes my new metric.
mhm.
And so what I tell people is, I'm like, look, if you have to willpower your way or count the number of days since the last time, you're still bound to the thing.
Nothing's wrong. Yeah.
Um, if you're in the arena with it fighting, it doesn't matter if you're winning or losing, you still smelling the body odor and you're still like,
Sure.
quit the fight,
Right.
forfeit the match, go outside and have a picnic at a
Yeah.
park across town
Uh-huh.
and enjoy your life.
Right.
I tell them, what entertains you trains you.
Mhm.
If the amount of entertainment that you are doing is a lifelong career of trying to heal yourself, if you're constantly focusing on the thing, you're just training yourself to constantly focus on the thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
And eventually you have to heal from your healing process.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And so my focus is like, let's focus on building something that feels so amazing in you that you wouldn't want to stop it.
Mhm.
That you just like, wow, this feels great. Let me keep doing
Yeah,
this.
absolutely. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, like, yeah, 21, 48 days, or in the guy's case that just texted me, it's 5 days later.
Right.
Uh, you start to see things happen. And what happens is, like, you just, in retrospect, you look back and you're like, wow, I handled that differently than I usually do.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't have to willpower my way to do it. It was like it just sort of happened on its own.
Right.
Cool,
Right. That
awesome.
it's on autopilot, as you said.
Yeah.
So sense. So what have I not asked you that you want to make sure you leave with our audience?
Okay, so a lot of people struggle with this notion that there's something about them that they have to fix, that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And if they're trying to learn about addiction or anxiety or depression or bipolar or OCD, or they're going down the rabbit hole because the feeling of those diagnoses is
Mhm.
that there's something that they have to fix.
Yeah.
I would submit to you that there's not anything wrong with you.
Mhm.
That the fact that you can feel those things means that everything is firing on all cylinders.
Mhm.
You have learned a way to automatically respond to life,
Mhm.
that you have 100% success rate. You have survived everything that has ever happened to you.
Right. Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with you. And if you can learn to do that on autopilot, you
Mhm.
can learn to do something else on autopilot. It's just
Sure.
changing the dojo that you attend.
Yes, that makes sense. That makes
And
sense. So,
so everybody, the reason I wrote my book, and one of the main things I wanted people to get out of it, is I wanted them to close the back cover and be like, wow, maybe there isn't anything wrong with me. I
mhm.
might have some work ahead,
Mhm.
but maybe I don't have to sit here and believe that I have something to fix, that I
Mhm.
have something to validate.
Mhm.
Because when you're not a parking ticket, you don't need to be validated, because that just gives you permission to stay put, to stay
Sure.
parked there.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And so you don't need to be validated in your emotion. Nobody wants to be validated in how they feel, really. They want to be done with that
Yeah,
negative feeling.
exactly. exactly.
And so instead of seeking that, like just recognize there's nothing to fix about you. The only question is what is happening in this moment? And
Right.
that boils down to what am I literally physically feeling?
Right.
How am I breathing and whatnot? And then the next question is, cool, where do I want to go from here? You don't
Mhm.
have to psychoanalyze it. You don't
Mhm.
have to sit there and dig in. You don't have to, therapists are helpful. I'm not saying that they're not,
Mhm.
but move like there's nothing wrong with you. It's just, okay, cool. What do I need some help to get out of this rut or can I do it on my own? That's it.
Mhm. Yeah. And so for people who are like, okay, cool, what's my next step? Who are listening to all of this, what would you recommend? Should people check out like you just the book at first, or should they go to your website? Should they where do people go to learn more about you?
So at my website, thefreedomspecialist.com, there's a the in the front.
Yep.
There's links to all kinds of stuff.
Perfect.
Start with the book.
Okay.
And the course that is companion to that book, the things I introduce in the book and
Hmm.
the guidebook that comes with it, the
Hmm.
course that goes with it is the Choose Your Own Emotion course. If
Hmm.
you were to get those together, that would give you not just a full, like expansive, really fun ride to read, like
Yeah.
plane crashes and odd science and all over the place, you
Right.
know, but also a step-by-step process of starting to change the way you feel within a few days
Hmm.
from now.
Yeah.
You should start to realize, wait a second, I did that. Like I can actually control how I feel.
Hmm.
Like there's some things that I can do. And even if it's a small amount, there's something like within just a few days time.
Yeah.
So start there. And then we also have like a longer program online. And these retreats are incredible, especially if you're struggling with some big things like
Right.
past traumas and stuff. I can't say enough about them. All the stuff that is hard to confront on your own,
Hmm.
to be there in a group of people and to like have a team of people helping you,
Delvin.
you
Yeah.
can set it down. Yeah.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Bob. This has been really, really insightful. I really appreciate it.
Well, good. It was good. It was a great conversation, Lauren.
Thanks.